Hi, I'm Jeff Provine. I'm here to talk about world building. In episode 4 of Storycrafting, we talked about how to use sensory details to make your setting come alive in your story. Now to talk about how to make that world before you can bring it to life. So whether your setting is 1990s New York City or a fantasy planet that somehow has lasers and rocket ships but still uses horses, as long as you create an internal logic to your system, readers will totally buy into it. Even a wacky made-up universe like Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which shows cartoons and humans living side by side in 1940s Los Angeles, totally works as long as the rules are laid out and they are followed. The audience is willing to give over a suspension of disbelief. They will say, well, this is ridiculous, but I'll follow. And through that, we can go on adventures like flying on the back of a hippogriff through the skies, or chasing Soviet attack submarines under the Arctic ice. But if you ever break these rules, then the suspension of disbelief is gone, and your audience will never forgive you. Have you ever seen a movie trailer and then arrived at the movie to find it was very different from what you thought it was? This happened to me with the movie Super. I thought it was going to be a comedy where Dwight from The Office was running around and hitting people with a wrench. But what it actually is a very introspective discussion of meaning and the shocking reality of violence in the real world. I still have nightmares. For both real world and made-up locations, the first thing to do is establish the rules of the world. A big help on this is doing your research. Once you determine the scope of your story, try to learn about as much of it as possible. Maybe it's the city of Bath in Regency, England. Or maybe it's a space program with sites on Earth, in orbit, and on a ship headed toward Europa. Whatever it is, you need to know as much about it as possible. Research the little things in your story as well. For example, if you think you can handle just writing a short story about a little town in anywhere America, even within that we're going to have particular details of different trees grow in different places, different weather is appreciated, and, for example, dialect. Do they call things sodas, or cokes, or pops, or cold drinks? All these little details come together and paint a picture for this town. So this is what you need to do in your story. Figure out all of the tiny little details, the facets of life that make up the world that we're in. And once you have those mastered, you'll have no problem coming together with the setting that is important to your story. If you're using a historical setting, you'll have to do a ton more research. So figure out the details of everyday life in this town. A good way to do this is watch interviews, read, if you're lucky enough, travel to this place, check out museums and ruins. But make sure that you know what these people are doing with their lives to interact with the world around them. What do they wear? What do they eat? What do they do for fun? These are all the little things that will make the world come together. Also watch out for those little anachronisms. So as you're describing what people eat and what people wear and what people do for fun, you might run into something that they didn't actually have. So for example, I'm sure that people standing there in the Globe Theater heard these bells chiming and said, hey, those weren't around in Caesar's time. I want my penny back. Yardlings. If you're creating your own setting, the real work is going to be taking all of the different strands that you want to include into this world and weaving them into a single logical structure. Say you want to write a romance with a fairy tale setting. So how are humans going to react with fairies? We have little sprites who can fly around and turn inanimate objects to life or transmute them into something completely different. If we look back into the research of the times, some people respected and feared in a positive way these fairies as all-powerful near deities. Other people were terrified by them. They looked for ways to protect themselves from fairy magic with cold wrought iron and different things like that. In your setting, each character might react a little bit differently, so pay attention to your characterization and tie it back to your setting. Why do the characters hold these ideals? All of this leads to my favorite part, which is asking, what if? So what you do is you plant the seed, this if, and then follow it through logically to see what answers need to come to this question. So what if people lived in a world where you weren't allowed to wear shoes? Well, looking at this logically, what happened to put the world into such a position that people carry this philosophy? Who holds enough power to make sure that people aren't wearing shoes? Do people govern themselves, or is there a policing entity around them? And then also, how are they getting from place to place? Do they all have smooth, very cared for paths? And what happens when people need to get off those paths? There's a lot of questions to be answered. Sometimes you might run into an issue where you don't know the answer to the question. So if you're trying to build an interstellar empire, but we know that nothing can travel faster than the speed of light, how is that going to work? How will planets communicate? This is a chance to do some more research, dig into science journals, see what people can propose, or check out some other science fiction. Maybe they've used various things that you could borrow from or give another twist on. Or maybe there's things out there that we don't know, and we can apply some little magic to it. Say it's dark matter. All these things will come out in your story as you're putting it together in the world. If you do run into these problems, don't give up. Maybe set it aside and let your subconscious work it for a while, but always come back to it and answer it, because you don't want to leave a big hole that your plot will fall into. Just like having round characters, you're going to want to have a solid round setting with both good and bad aspects of everything in it. As an example, in our modern world, these little handheld devices that can connect us to video chats and across entire continents for free across Skype, or let us dial into a database of all available information in the universe on Wikipedia. And yet, we're constantly glued to them watching cat videos to the point that we are sleep deprived and over-medicated. That was what makes a good setting. To do this, as you're coming up with your story, not only think about the logical aspects of it, but ask yourself why. What impact does this have? What does this mean for the people in it? You might stand in front of a mirror and ask yourself to answer these things. Or if you have a good writing buddy, somebody who's a strong sounding board that isn't afraid to tell you that's a dumb idea, tell them everything about your story, and when they pause or get a little confused, this is a good chance to take a step back and rethink about your story. So in my story, everybody's controlled by this maniacal dictator in this post-apocalyptic world. So what's keeping people from just walking away and living as a mountain man? Nuclear fallout. Yeah. And that's how you can come up with a richer, more vibrant world, just by answering these logical questions. Setting establishes the rules of your story world, whether it's a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away where people can tap into a mystic energy field and help them pilot spaceships, or a not too distant future where geneticists figured out how to clone dinosaurs and now they want to start a zoo, bearing no expense. Lay out your rules, and as long as you follow them, your audience will gladly follow too, even if it's a fairy godmother popping out of nowhere and helping the protagonist get a new gown, a pumpkin coach, and some horses made out of mice. In the info below, I've attached a worksheet you can use to keep track of all the details of your world. Start with the scope of your setting, whether downtown Manhattan or a continent filled with fantasy empires. Then determine the big things like climate and technology. Next, think about the society at large. What's the economy like? Are people rich or poor? What do people do for a living? What's their religions like? How rigid are people and their moral stigmas? And then look at the people themselves. What do they look like physically? How do they dress? What are their families like? What is the music like? To really go into detail, you can draw a map to keep track of where your characters are and will be, or you can go into detail about the history. These are things that epic fantasy lovers really eat up. Just like with the characterization worksheet, you don't necessarily have to fill this out completely, but you have to make sure that you know your setting well enough that you can go into detail on each one of these. Know what is important for your story, and use that. If you create an entire dictionary to go along with your made-up language, that's fantastic. But if nobody ever speaks in it, then what's the point? As you're writing your story, keep all these rules and details about your story world in heart, or even on a poster on the wall where you can see them. So remember that your characters are a product of your setting, and remember that your plot is the goal of your character. All these details are tied together as integral parts of the story. None of them are necessarily more important than the others because they all need to be there together. So, character, plot, and setting, the three parts of a story. That takes us to the end of episode 4.1. Writers, keep writing.